Jackson, Mississippi, 1963. The summer air hung thick as wet cotton, carrying with it the tension of a nation trembling on the edge of change. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of El Reyne subdivision, a man walked each day with the weight of an entire people on his shoulders. His name was Medgar Wiley Evers, a veteran, a husband, a father, and the NAACP's first field secretary in Mississippi. To some, he was a beacon of dignity and hope. To others, he was a threat that needed silencing. In those months, the fight for freedom felt like walking through fire. Churches burned under the cover of night, children marched with trembling hands, and men like Evers risked their lives to teach black families how to vote, how to stand, how to live unafraid in a land built to break them. He knew the danger. He felt it every time a car slowed near his house, every time his children asked why strangers stared at them, and yet he moved forward, steady, unwavering, as though God himself had carved a path beneath his feet. June 12th began like any other. Humid dawn, quiet streets, the soft hum of a city pretending not to be divided. But by nightfall, the world would shift. A single gunshot outside Medgar Evers' home would echo far beyond Mississippi, carrying with it the grief, fury, and unbroken resolve of a people who refused to lay down their humanity. This is the story of that night. One man's courage, one nation's reckoning, and the moment when a hero met the cost of justice at his own front door. The evening settled over Jackson like a weary sigh, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and fading gold. Medgar Evers drove home along Gine Street with the slow, deliberate caution of a man who knew every mile carried danger. His shirt still clung to the heat of the day, smelling faintly of sweat, ink, and the dust of courthouse steps where he had spent hours fighting for the rights of those who had none. The radio murmured freedom songs in the background, soft but insistent, their harmonies lifting like prayers over the hum of the engine. Even in that quiet moment, he felt the gaze of Mississippi upon him, some eyes filled with hope, others sharpened with hate. As he turned into the driveway, the world seemed to hold its breath. The porch light cast a pool of soft amber across the carport, illuminating the familiar outline of the white station wagon, the same one he used for marches, meetings, funerals, and homecomings. His children waited inside, lightly peering through the curtains, eager to greet him with the restless joy only a father's return can stir. Yet beneath that tenderness ran a current of unease. Not a day passed when the family didn't listen for strange footsteps, distant engines, or the hush of men who moved like shadows. Medgar felt it too, the unseen presence watching, waiting, but he stepped out of the car anyway, dignity carried with the same quiet certainty as his briefcase. The air was thick enough to taste. Crickets droned in the dark bushes, mixing with the faint rustle of leaves swaying under the slightest whisper of wind. Medgar closed the car door gently, not wanting to wake his neighbors, not wanting to draw attention, though attention followed him like a restless ghost. For a moment he stood still, letting the night wrap around him, letting the exhaustion of the day settle into his bones. He thought of the families he had met, the threats he had heard, the fires he had seen smoldering across Mississippi, and yet he lifted his head, eyes fixed on the soft glow spilling from the window of his home, a promise of rest, of love, of purpose. He took his first step toward the door. The night pressed close around him, warm and breathless, the kind of southern darkness that seemed to thicken with secrets. Medgar walked slowly toward the front steps, each footfall measured, each breath deep, as though trying to steady the tremor of unease that lived just beneath his ribs. The weight of the day still clung to him, the meetings crowded with anxious faces, the long hours spent documenting threats, the quiet courage of families who whispered their names into voter rolls, despite knowing the danger it brought. His briefcase felt heavier than usual, filled not only with papers, but with the collective faith of those who believed freedom could be born from persistence. As he crossed the yard, he sensed the familiar vulnerability of the open space, the knowledge that no amount of courage could shield a man from a bullet fired under the cover of hate. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a neighborhood dog barked once and fell silent, the sound cut short like a warning swallowed by the wind. The street behind him appeared still, yet he knew stillness in Mississippi often meant something was hiding beneath the calm. He glanced toward the neighbors' houses. porches dark, curtains drawn, the quiet resignation of lives lived under the watchful eye of a world that punished witness. Medgar had grown used to the solitude of leadership, the way danger separated a man from the comforts he longed to protect. He could feel its presence now, a cold thread pulling tight at the base of his spine, but he refused to let it change his stride. His children were waiting behind that door, and a father's love overcame every whispered threat the world threw at him. As he neared the small, concrete walkway that led to the porch, a single beam of moonlight slipped through the clouds, illuminating the driveway in a pale, ghost-like sheen. He paused for the briefest moment, not out of fear, but out of a solemn instinct, the sense that nights like this carried weight beyond understanding. His mind traveled to the marches planned for the coming days, the long road ahead for Mississippi's children, the fragile hope he carried like a flame, cupped between trembling hands. The cicadas droned louder now, a rising hum that filled the air like a tide. Medgar inhaled the humid night, tasting the familiar blend of magnolia, dust, and danger. And then, steady and unbroken, he stepped forward toward the threshold of home, unaware that a rifle waited in the shadows with its own terrible purpose. The crickets fell into an uncanny hush, as though the night itself leaned in to witness what came next. Medgar lifted his briefcase slightly, adjusting his grip as he reached the steps, his shoulders bowing under the long fatigue of a day spent wrestling with Mississippi's hardest truths. He thought of Myrlie inside, likely keeping the children awake longer than she intended, their small faces pressed to the window in anticipation of his return. That thought softened him, easing the tightness in his jaw, warming the exhaustion in his bones. For a fleeting breath, he allowed himself to imagine an ordinary evening, a dinner reheated, a kiss on the forehead of each child, a quiet conversation at the kitchen table. But ordinary was a luxury the fight had long taken from him, and even in that tender moment, the air pulsed with the quiet warning of unseen eyes. From across the street, the silhouette of the magnolia tree loomed like a sentinel carved from shadow, its branches hanging heavy, veiling the corner of the yard where darkness pooled thickest. A faint rustle stirred the leaves, subtle, intentional, the kind of sound that did not belong to the wind. Medgar's step hitched, barely perceptible, but enough for his instincts to flare. The countless threats, the nightly phoned promises of violence, the murmured warnings from friends urging him to carry a weapon, all rose at once like cold fingers at the back of his neck. He turned his head slightly, scanning the darkness, his eyes narrowing as they tried to pierce the unseen. Yet the street stared back with a stillness so complete it felt rehearsed, as though silence itself had been staged to hide a single deadly truth. And then, in the breath between one heartbeat and the next, the world split open. A sudden flash, sharp, white, merciless, burst from the shadows, followed by the thunderous crack of a rifle that shattered the quiet night. The force hit him like a storm, driving him forward, wrenching the breath from his lungs, as pain bloomed fierce and blinding across his chest. He staggered, the briefcase slipping from his grasp, papers scattering like wounded birds across the concrete. The porch light flickered on his falling frame, catching the shock in his eyes, the unfinished prayer on his lips, the terrible fragility of a moment meant to be ordinary. In that instant, before his body struck the ground, the night bore witness to a sacrifice carved into the heart of a nation, a single shot that would echo far beyond Mississippi's borders and awaken a country trembling for justice. For a long, suspended moment, the night seemed to forget how to breathe. The echo of the gunshot drifted through the neighborhood like a cruel proclamation, rolling across rooftops and settling into the trembling stillness that followed. Medgar lay on the driveway, the warm concrete beneath him turning strangely distant, as though the world was slipping just beyond reach. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, each one edged with fire, each one a struggle against the darkness pulling at him. The thick Mississippi air clung to his skin, carrying the smell of magnolia and gunpowder, a bitter blend that marked the final threshold of his long and weary fight. Above him, the porch light swayed gently, casting shifting halos across the yard, illuminating the scattered papers that fluttered like fallen wings around his still form. Inside the house, Myrlie heard the blast instinctively, not as a sound, but as a rupture. Something deep within her snapped awake, a mother's instinct sharpened. By months of dread and whispered threats, the children froze, their small faces pale as the walls seemed to tremble with the force of what had happened. Without waiting for thought or fear to fully form, Myrlie rushed toward the door, her heart pounding with a terror she had prayed never to meet. As she stepped onto the threshold, the scene before her carved itself into her soul with unbearable clarity. Her husband on the ground, the porch light trembling above him, the night around them unnaturally still, as though creation itself recoiled from the violence done to its son. Her cry rose from a place deeper than grief, a sound shaped by love, fear, and the ancient ache of every woman who had ever watched hatred steal a man from her arms. She dropped to her knees beside him, the concrete burning her skin, her hands trembling as they reached for his. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, clouded with pain, yet still holding the fierce, gentle fire she had loved. Since the day they met, blood darkened the fabric of his shirt, spreading in slow, heavy breaths, each pulse a reminder of how swiftly life could be stolen. Myrlie whispered his name, her voice breaking, her fingers brushing his cheek as though her touch alone could anchor him to the living world. Medgar tried to speak, not out of fear, but with the quiet urgency of a man who knew his time was slipping away. Yet the words dissolved before they reached the air, leaving only the fragile sound of his breathing and the desperate rhythm of a wife refusing to surrender him to the night. In that sacred, shattering moment, the driveway became a battlefield, a holy ground where love fought its final, trembling fight against the cruelty that had hunted him for so long. The neighborhood awoke in fragments, a window lifted, a whisper carried down the street, a screen door creaking open with trembling hesitation. Fear had taught people in Jackson to move slowly at night, to measure every step against the danger that often waited in the dark. Yet on this night, something deeper than fear pulled them from their homes. One by one, figures emerged, neighbors who had watched Medgar's tireless work with reverence, who had prayed for his safety at kitchen tables, who had wondered each morning whether Mississippi would allow him another day. They approached cautiously, drawn by the unmistakable cry of Myrlie's grief and the heavy silence that followed the shot. The dim glow of porch lights flickered to life up and down the block, each one shining like a small, trembling witness to the violence that had split their world open. Among the first to reach the driveway was a neighbor who had long admired Medgar from afar, a man who knew the risks of stepping forward but could not bear to remain still. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he knelt beside Myrlie, his hands hovering, unsure where to begin, what to touch, how to help. Medgar's breathing came in short, ragged bursts, each one more fragile than the last, his chest rising beneath Myrlie's trembling hands. The neighbor whispered, "Hold on, brother, hold on," though the words felt too small, too thin against the weight of the moment. The street seemed to close in around them, the open sky shrinking into a narrow corridor of porch lights, shadows, and the desperate hope that life might cling to a man who had given so much of his own to others. Inside the house, the children stood frozen at the doorway, their small silhouettes framed by the trembling light. They were too young to understand the full scope of the violence, yet instinct told them that something sacred was breaking before their eyes. Ruth clutched her brother's hand tightly, as though anchoring him to the world. The youngest, trembling, whispered, "Daddy," in a voice soft enough to shatter the heart of anyone who heard it. Myrlie turned just enough to shield them from the worst of the scene, her body forming a barrier between innocence and horror. Her tears fell silently onto Medgar's shirt, mixing with the dark stain spreading there. She wanted to gather the children in her arms, to pull them inside where danger could not find them, but she could not leave Medgar's side. In that moment, she felt time collapsing, the past they had built together, the future they had prayed for, all folding into the fragile struggle for one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more stolen moment beneath the trembling Mississippi sky. Sirens began as a distant wail, a thin thread of sound stretching across the sleeping city, growing louder, sharper, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. They approached with a slowness that felt impossible, as though time itself resisted moving forward. Myrlie could hear them long before the red lights appeared at the end of the street, each passing second stretching into something unbearable. Medgar's breaths had grown shallower, his chest rising only after long, trembling pauses, each one leaving her suspended between hope and despair. She whispered to him continuously, soft, steady, urgent, trying to keep him anchored, trying to remind him of every reason he had fought so long and so hard. But his eyes had taken on a distant sheen, as though he were seeing something beyond the reach of this broken world. When the ambulance finally pulled into the driveway, its lights sweeping across the quiet homes, the scene froze for a heartbeat. The medics, young and pale-faced, hesitated for the briefest moment, not because of uncertainty, but because they recognized the man before them. The weight of his name, his work, his danger, pressed against their chests. Yet Myrlie's anguished voice broke their paralysis. She stepped aside only enough to let them through, refusing to remove her hand from Medgar's shoulder, grounding him with the strength of her touch. The medics knelt, their movements hurried but controlled, their voices low and tense as they assessed his wounds. One lifted Medgar's head gently, another checked the steady dark flow beneath his ribs, but the truth settled among them like a heavy stone. This was no simple rescue. This was a man fighting the final breaths of a battle he had waged long before this night. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, the children cried out, their small voices trembling like shattered glass. Myrlie turned toward them, gathering them close with one arm, while keeping her eyes fixed on Medgar's still form. The stretcher wheels rattled across the concrete, a sound too cold, too mechanical for the sacredness of the moment. The neighbors stepped back, forming a narrow path, their faces carved with sorrow, fear, and the dawning realization of what this loss would mean. The ambulance doors swung open, spilling harsh white light onto the driveway, illuminating the scattered papers still fluttering in the faint night breeze. For a moment, Medgar's hand slipped from beneath the sheet, his fingers half-curled, reaching towards something unseen. Myrlie pressed her palm against the window as they closed the doors, whispering through the glass, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "Hold on, my love, hold on." And as the ambulance pulled away, its siren rising once more into the night, the street fell into a silence so profound it felt like the world itself was holding vigil. The ambulance sped through Jackson's narrow streets, its siren slicing through the humid night, echoing against storefronts and shuttered windows. Inside, the air was thick with antiseptic and the metallic scent of blood. Medgar lay motionless on the stretcher, his breaths faint and uneven, each one fluttering like a candle bent beneath a storm. The medic beside him worked with trembling urgency, pressing gauze against the wound, checking his pulse again and again, as though willing it to strengthen. The harsh overhead light cast a pale glow over Medgar's face, revealing the unmistakable mix of strain and serenity settled across his features, the expression of a man who had long accepted the cost of the path he walked. His blood soaked into the white sheet, spreading in slow, dark blooms that marked time more honestly than any clock. Myrlie sat in the front passenger seat, her body twisting toward the small window that looked into the back of the ambulance. Her fingers pressed against the glass, her knuckles white with desperation, her voice breaking as she called out his name whenever the road curved or the vehicle lurched. She could not see him clearly, only the blur of movement, the flash of hands working frantically, the brief glimpses of his face under the cold fluorescent light. The siren wailed above them, but beneath that noise she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, fierce and frantic. Every mile felt endless, every turn an Eternity, as though the distance between the present moment and the hospital stretched into a trial of faith. She prayed with each breath, whispered words not shaped by scripture, but by the raw, trembling hope that love alone could hold him to this earth a little longer. At the hospital entrance, bright lights bathed the driveway in a stark, merciless glow. Nurses rushed forward as the back doors slammed open, the stretcher emerging in a blur of motion, wheels clattering across the pavement. Voices rose, sharp, urgent commands, as they pushed Medgar through the double doors, disappearing into the labyrinth of sterile hallways beyond. Myrlie tried to follow, but a nurse caught her by the arm, gently yet firmly holding her back. She stood there gasping, her eyes locked on the space where her husband had vanished, her hands trembling at her sides as though they no longer knew what to hold on to. The automatic doors slid shut with a mechanical sigh, sealing Medgar. Behind them, in that instant, the world outside the hospital dissolved into an expanse of grief and suspended time. The night pressing down on her with the full weight of everything she feared was slipping away. Inside the hospital, the corridors glowed with an unforgiving whiteness, the kind of light that revealed every fear, every tremor, every truth a person wished to hide. Myrlie stood alone in its center, her breaths shallow and trembling, her hands clasped tightly together as though holding herself upright against a force intent on crushing her. Doctors and nurses moved past in swift, determined motions, white coats fluttering, shoes clicking across polished floors, but each person seemed to drift around her as if she were anchored in a different realm of time. The world continued its relentless pace, yet she felt suspended, caught in the silent chasm between hope and inevitability. The clock above the waiting room door ticked loudly, each second hammering her with the brutal reminder that she could not follow Medgar beyond the walls where they had taken him. A nurse guided her to a chair, but she could not sit. Her legs shook with the aftershock of everything she had held inside on the driveway. The terror, the pleading, the helplessness, now rising in waves that threatened to spill over. She stared at the double doors that had swallowed Medgar, willing them to open, willing someone to return with news that defied the gunshot she had heard, the blood she had touched, the truth she already felt in the marrow of her bones. Every few moments she would whisper his name under her breath, as though calling him softly through the walls might tether him to this world. Behind her, footsteps echoed in long, hollow rhythms down the corridor, each pair sounding like the one that might bring an answer, yet none carried the voice she longed to hear. In a small cluster of seats nearby, a group of local activists and friends arrived breathlessly, faces drawn tight with fear and disbelief. They stood around her in a quiet circle, hesitant to touch her, afraid that even the gentlest hand would shatter the fragile stillness she clung to. One man, someone who had marched with Medgar earlier that week, stepped forward, his voice low, reverent, shaking. "We're here, Myrlie. We're here with you." She nodded, but her eyes never left those closed doors. The murmur of whispered prayers spread through, the group rising softly like incense in the white, sterile air. Nurses passed by with solemn faces, their silence speaking louder than any words could. And as the minutes stretched into a long, aching unknown, the hospital seemed to shift around her, no longer a place of healing, but a sacred threshold where love and grief stood side by side, waiting for the moment that would define them forever. Time moved strangely in the waiting room, not in minutes or hours, but in the slow, painful widening of silence. Myrlie stood gripping the back of a chair, her fingers digging into the vinyl, as though the anchoring touch might steady the trembling storm inside her. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting an anemic glow that flattened every shadow, leaving no place for fear to hide. Somewhere down the hall, a metal tray clattered, followed by hurried footsteps, and she flinched at the sound, her heart leaping toward the possibility of news. But the corridors remained unchanged, stretching cold and indifferent beneath the weight of a night that felt endless. She closed her eyes and pictured Medgar's face, the way he smiled at their children, the quiet resolve in his gaze each morning, and she whispered a prayer so soft it barely rose above her breath, asking God to hold him in the places where her hands could not reach. The activists who had gathered around her exchanged glances heavy with unspoken dread. Some paced the hallway, their shoes tapping out restless patterns against the polished floor. Others bowed their heads, murmuring prayers through clenched teeth, their voices trembling with the knowledge that heroes were not supposed to bleed in driveways or fade beneath hospital lights. One woman, an elder from the NAACP office, her face lined with years of struggle, approached Myrlie and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's strong," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "Stronger than any bullet." Myrlie nodded, but her throat tightened with the memory of his collapsing body, the warm blood beneath her fingertips, the sound of their children crying into the night. She wanted to believe in strength, in miracles, in the possibility that love could defy the violence that had hunted them for so long. But the weight of the moment pressed heavily against her hope. At last, the doors at the end of the hallway opened with a slow, deliberate sigh. A doctor stepped out, a tall man with tired eyes, his white coat stained at the cuffs. The world seemed to tilt as he walked toward her, each step echoing through the corridor like a solemn drumbeat. Myrlie's breath caught in her chest. She felt the floor sway beneath her, felt the prayers around her fall silent, felt every heart in the hallway strain toward the single truth approaching. The doctor paused before her, his face carved with sorrow, his voice soft but unyielding. In that instant, before he even spoke, she knew. The air thickened, pressing in on her, and her knees weakened as the night closed around her with crushing certainty. The doctor lowered his gaze and delivered the words that would forever divide her life into a before and an after. And though the world remained standing, something sacred within her broke quietly, irrevocably, beneath the weight of unbearable loss. The words struck her like a sudden emptiness, a hollowing of the world so complete that for a moment she could not hear anything at all. Not the doctor's quiet voice, not the murmured gasps around her, not even her own heartbeat. It was as though time itself had collapsed inward, creating a silence too vast for breath to cross. Myrlie swayed, gripping the edge of a chair to keep herself from falling, her vision blurring as the room shifted in slow, disjointed waves. The doctor's eyes were gentle, full of the sorrow of a man who had carried too many of these messages, but nothing in his face could soften the truth he bore. Medgar was gone. The man who had walked into danger every day with dignity and unwavering resolve had been taken in a single moment on the threshold of his own home. The love of her life, the father of her children, the voice of a bruised and rising Mississippi, silenced by a rifle fired from the shadows. A soft, fragile cry broke from the doorway behind her. The children had been brought inside, still in their nightclothes, their faces pale in the sterile light. Ruth clung to her brother's hand, both of them staring with wide, searching eyes at their mother, sensing the truth before it was spoken aloud. Myrlie knelt down, her knees trembling as she opened her arms to them. They fell into her embrace, their small bodies shaking with fear and confusion as they pressed their faces into her chest. She held them tightly, so tightly she could feel their hearts beating against her ribs, anchoring her even as her own heart splintered. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, falling into their hair, onto their trembling shoulders. She wanted to shield them, to keep them from the cruelty of this night, but there was no hiding from the loss that had reshaped the air around them. The grief that enveloped her was not a storm, but an ocean, heavy, endless, merciless, and she stood in its first crushing wave with her children clutched to her like lifelines. Behind her, the activists formed a circle, their faces bowed in grief and fury. One man pressed his fist to his mouth, shaking with the effort to contain his sobs. Another stared at the wall, jaw clenched so tightly it seemed to strain against his very bones. A woman sank into a nearby chair, clutching a handkerchief to her eyes, as tears spilled freely. In their anguish, there was something deeper than sorrow, a rising fire, a collective understanding that Medgar's death was not merely a tragedy, but a call carved in blood across the conscience of a nation. His absence left a void no single voice could fill, yet within that void something stirred, the beginning of a movement strengthened by his sacrifice. Myrlie rose slowly, still holding her children, her spine straightening with a resolve born from the deepest chambers of grief. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but unbreakable. "His work will not die," she whispered, and every soul in that room knew she spoke the truth. Morning crept slowly over Jackson, pale and exhausted, as though even the sun hesitated to rise on a world so freshly wounded. Outside the hospital, clusters of people began to gather, men still in their work clothes, women with scarves hastily tied over their hair, elders leaning on canes, young activists with their fists tucked tightly into their pockets to still their trembling. Word of Medgar's death had spread through the city like a broken cry carried on the wind, reaching porches, kitchens, prayer circles and boarding houses before the night had fully ended. They came not out of curiosity, but out of a grief so communal it felt like a single shared heartbeat. Faces pressed together in a mosaic of sorrow, some glistening with tears, others hardened into solemn lines of disbelief. Every person there understood they were standing at the edge of something larger than loss. They were witnessing a martyrdom carved into the soul of a people rising from centuries of silence. Inside, Myrlie moved through the corridor with a steadiness that astonished even those who loved her most. Her children walked on either side of her, their small hands locked in hers, their steps slow and uncertain. Grief had hollowed her, yes, carved deep trenches of pain beneath her eyes, pulled her shoulders into a quiet ache, but it had also placed something fierce and unyielding within her. As she approached the room where Medgar rested, a hush swept over those gathered nearby. The air felt sacred, heavy with the presence of every life he had touched. When she stepped across the threshold, the room seemed to expand around her, as though making space for the weight she carried. She approached him slowly, each step echoing softly on the linoleum, her breath trembling as she reached for his hand. His skin was cool beneath her fingertips, but the imprint of his warmth, the years of shared courage and sacrifice, lived still in her palms. She leaned over him, her forehead lowering gently to his, her tears slipping silently onto the sheet that covered his chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the man who had fought with every breath he'd drawn, and the woman who had stood beside him through every storm. She whispered to him, words too soft for others to hear, shaped from love, memory, and the unbearable ache of goodbye. Behind her, the children pressed close, reaching for the edge of the sheet, their little hands trembling as they tried to understand the stillness of the father who had once lifted them with such strength and joy. Myrlie lifted her head, her voice breaking but resolute. "They will know your name," she whispered. "They will know why you lived and why you were taken." And in that quiet room, thick with sorrow and reverence, her promise rose like a vow carried by every heartbeat present. His legacy would not fade, it would ignite. When the body was released to the family, the sun had fully risen, a muted, grieving light that cast long shadows across the hospital lawn. Outside, the crowd had grown into a sea of mourners stretching along the sidewalk, their faces lifted toward the doors with a reverence usually reserved for saints. As Medgar was brought out beneath a draped sheet, an audible shudder rippled through them, a collective exhale of sorrow, rage, and awe. Hats came off, hands clasped together. Some fell to their knees, others lifted their faces skyward, eyes burning with the fire of a people refusing to be broken again. There were no chants, no speeches, no raised fists, only silence, deep and thunderous, the kind that carried more power than any shouted cry. His sacrifice had carved a wound, but it had also forged a unity that those who fired the shot could never have imagined. The procession toward the funeral home moved slowly, each step an act of devotion. Cars followed in solemn formation, their engines barely whispering over the stillness of the morning. Along the route, more people joined, stepping out of doorways and storefronts, leaving behind the ordinary rhythms of their day. Some held Bibles pressed to their chests, others carried photographs of loved ones lost to the same violence that had taken Medgar. They walked as though escorting not just a man, but an entire generation's hope. Bruised, battered but unextinguished. Inside the car, Myrlie held her children close, their heads resting against her shoulders, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and heartbreak. She looked out the window at the gathering masses and felt something rise within her, not comfort, not ease, but a fierce, steadying strength. Her grief had become a mantle, heavy and sacred, and she understood that she would carry it the rest of her life. When they reached the funeral home, the crowd halted and parted, creating a path wide enough for the pallbearers. As Medgar was carried inside, sunlight poured across the threshold, turning the dust in the air into drifting shards of gold. It felt for a moment like a benediction, as though the heavens themselves paused to honor the man who had walked fearlessly into the storm for the sake of others. Inside, preparations began for the viewing, where tens of thousands would come to stand before his open casket to witness the brutality that had taken him and the unwavering dignity that remained in his face, even in death. Yet before the doors opened to the public, Myrlie stood alone in the still room, her hand pressed gently to the polished wood. She whispered a final promise to the love she had lost, her voice steady despite the breaking inside her. "Your fight is ours now." Outside, the crowd waited, ready to mourn, ready to march, ready to rise, carrying his legacy like a torch passed from one heart to the next.